You're listening to IAM Pulse, a podcast discussing all things identity access management, from defending against cyber attacks and to enhancing your overall cybersecurity strategy. This podcast is brought to you by BioKey International, an innovative provider of flexible, secure access management and biometric identity solutions. We're sitting down to talk about the impact of identity access management makes on you and your business. Hello everyone, welcome to the first episode of IAM Pulse, a podcast dedicated to discussing IAM topics brought to you by BioKey International. Today we're talking about deploying multi-factor authentication, or MFA, into your organization and how to make it go smoothly. On the panel today we have three members from the BioKey team: Kim Johnson, VP of Product Marketing, Christopher Perry, Senior Technical Support Engineer, and Kevin Weiser, our Solutions Architect. Let's switch over to our panel and see what they're talking about.
But we're going to get kicked off with a couple of the questions that when I met with Christopher and Kevin and said, okay, what do customers mainly want to know or ask about, especially when it goes to deploying MFA? And even in that question, right, how can I make this go smoothly, would probably imply it doesn't always go that smoothly, right? And so, Christopher, I'm going to start with you. We've talked about kind of the first question quite a bit, but what are those common mistakes, right? Those gotchas that you've seen organizations hit when they're trying to implement MFA, either for a portion of their users or maybe it's customers as well?
Sure thing. So obviously the biggest thing to keep in mind is these things tend to be semi-unique for everybody, but if you had to boil it right down to things that happen more often than they should, pretty much the biggest gotcha I ever come across is a lot of customers, of ours, they try to do too much too fast. And I know it's a little vague, so let me boil it down a little bit further, but it basically comes down to the idea is, hey, we need multi-factor, and then too often people say, okay, let's just turn it on. And when you do that, you skip a whole lot of steps that make things run a little bit smoothly, and you have to start stumbling over things as you discover them, which in the best of scenarios is never fun, but especially with multi-factor, when you've got a whole user base that's actually reacting to this new system, that can be kind of a technical nightmare. So that's really the biggest gotcha that I'm always handling is, trying to walk people through, okay, before we make any changes, let's take a step back, look at the big picture and see exactly what needs to be done and then when we need to do it. So that's kind of my introduction. I'll leave it there for anybody who wants to kick in before I dive into some more gotchas.
Sure.
Totally. Oh, sorry, Kim.
No, go ahead, Kevin. I was just about to field it over to you to see kind of your high-level gotchas you got out there.
I would totally echo Chris's first statement there, and I would maybe even expand upon it a little bit. That I think a mistake a lot of prospective customers make is that they rush this and they decide to do it after a breach. And the right time to have multi-factor authentication and security in place is before you have a breach, not after the fact. That probably seems obvious, but we wouldn't have so many of these problems if it wasn't, a common thread, right? Where that goes though is a lot of times customers make a decision in a rush. They don't really look at all the options available to them. They don't lay out a firm plan for what types of users they're going to want to, implement this to. I mean, I would recommend every user is a critical user potentially, right? Not just your VIPs and your execs. Every user is critical because every user has some type of data that you probably want to protect, whether that's IP or that's PII. I almost guarantee that almost every single user in your environment has access to something that you probably would prefer a hacker not have access to. But as part of that, you want to lay out a good plan. You want to look at all the options available to you, what types of different methods work. Look at all your kind of like your weird users, and make a plan based off of that, because everybody's got that weird user, the user that works out in the field. They're the engineer who works on a pumping, rig or something like that, and maybe fingerprint biometrics isn't really awesome for them, or maybe they're out on an oil rig somewhere in the middle of the Gulf, and cell phone service isn't great, so maybe SMS is not a good choice for them. So you really got to look at this from all angles and not rush into it.
Excellent. Yeah, and I've seen that where they blanket, right? And sometimes it's picking one method and then applying that across every single user.
And
And that
sometimes
seems
that's a great choice. I mean, it can be for the right organization, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
right. And Christopher, you hit on a really good, you hit a kind of two mistakes, right? So one is the technical implementation. And then one is more of like the user adoption, it seems like, right? Or the education. So what kind of like the technical or maybe policy type gotchas have both of you seen? Christopher, we can start with you on that one.
Sure. And I think this does tie nicely into what both Kevin and I were saying, but it really kind of comes down to knowing the scope. So the first stage is always knowing, okay, who should be doing what. Like Kevin said, sometimes that's as easy as saying, hey, everybody's going to be using biometrics because everybody can, and that's the easy way to do it. But from kind of a user perspective, a lot of the gotchas are really just not having other options. So sometimes having biometrics is great, but just like Kevin said, I might not be able to use it. And is that really the only way I can get in from an end user? And does it have to be? So a lot of those gotchas is really understanding not only who is doing multi-factor, but their specific use cases. Because not planning around the user really ends up, in the long run, of just causing way more calls to the help desk saying, hey, I know I have to use this thing, but I don't have it. So what, do I have to drive all the way home to get my reader? It kind of puts them in that position where they're going to end up calling you and taking up your help desk time because nobody really thought to say, hey, what if they don't have their reader? Is there another way we can still access this resource securely and give them an option to get in? So that's really kind of a low level one, but one that's often overlooked is just addressing the how of it and looking at it from a person perspective, not just a technical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I would add in there too, I think, I'm always looking at market trends, what people are, best practices, compliance standards. And it's been phenomenal to watch where the message out there is phone-based, 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 right? Like if you go out, a lot of the conversations and everything else are around these phone-based methods. And so while that's, somewhat convenient, right? We all carrying around these smartphones with us and everything else. Recent stats show about 15% of your employees and 50% of customers are not able to use it, whether it's cell phone service, whether it's accessibility. And now there's actually been requirements that you have to pay for employee SMS plans, right? So if you're doing text-based one-time passwords, that's something that you're now going to have to pay for. So sounds like, without looking at not only where the users are, the requirements of the users, and having a good plan for that, you also have to be careful of what costs and kind of those limitations are, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really accurate, Kim. Those are all important things to look at. It's a real common thing that we run across when we talk to SLED customers, so state, local education customers, just in case anybody's familiar with SLED. It's real common that you talk to a government agency and they say, yeah, we've got these employees we're going to roll out. We're going to tell them we're going to use Google Authenticator as an example, or Authy, or some other phone app service, not just the SMS, right? And somebody pushes back and says, well, wait a minute now, you want me to use my private phone for work purposes? You should pay for my cell phone plan. And all of a sudden, the cost that they were thinking to themselves of, well, this is free, less the licensing that I'm purchasing from BioKey or whomever I'm buying from. Well, all of a sudden now I'm paying for 50 users phone plans at $50 a month, and this is a lot more per user than I thought it was going to be, right? And usually they don't do that. Obviously, what they do is they back off and they pick another method at that point because but that really does go back to that kind of planning thing. Have you talked to any of your user base? Have you planned for what this is going to look like? I can give a really, really good example about of MFA being deployed in an environment, and the admins just really didn't think this through. So we did a deployment a few years ago with a police department in Ohio, a big city police department, and they really like biometrics, which I'm a big fan of. I'm a big fan of fingerprint biometrics as a methodology, but they wanted to implement this in squad cars, right? So. The problem that they ran into is they got everything deployed. They put all these readers in the squad cars. Everything's going groovy, and then winter hits. And what happened is all the officers in the cars don't like taking their gloves off. So if you're going to do fingerprint biometrics, wearing a heavy duty winter glove doesn't really work with that, right? And so where we had, where they were tracking approval and usage and amongst the user base, because they had a portal where they were kind of like keeping track of this early early stages of deployment. If you looked at the summer months, everybody was really happy with the system. They really liked it. And then they got into late fall and into winter and in the early spring where it was really cold out. And all of a sudden that uptake and that usage and that approval rating, internally tanked. And it's like, okay, well, we need a different option here. So in that scenario, we implemented a different MFA option. We actually implemented key cards with that, which we can do with web keys. Is one of the things we can do. We can do card access badges as an MFA method. But we issued those to the squad cars instead that were out on patrol and that kind of thing. And so those users, that's relatively easy to do with a pair of gloves, whereas actually removing them to do a fingerprint swipe wasn't. So again, that's that kind of thing about thinking about my weird users, my kind of odd scenarios and thinking, I don't want to use that cliche outside the box, but just looking at the box from a very, very distant view and then looking very, very closely at the box, as in a second review, where are my outliers? Who are my weirdos, for lack of better words?
Right. And I think I have a lot of healthcare background. And I think that's just so important. Back office staff, people that are necessarily maybe at a machine all the time, or they have that type of access, or I don't know, not wearing gloves, is definitely good to maybe use a biometric solution for them. Then you have doctors that are going, rounding around the hospital, and a lot of them, if they're surgeons, don't even have necessarily a fingerprint left. So it's really important that you give them another option or something they don't have to touch any device. So like a push token for somebody like that is an excellent way to provide them with a more secure method, but that doesn't impede what they're trying to do. Because you also have to take into consideration what's that user trying to accomplish. If they're trying to save a life, or if they're trying to, process maybe medical records in an office, those are very, very different situations.
Absolutely.
So we do have a question that came in. Thank you, Craig. So do we have a popular non-phone option that is used well with PortalGuard, preferably low cost? So Kevin,
oh, okay. I'll take the first crack at it then.
Take the first crack at it. I have a guess. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay. Well, I would actually, and you're going to say, well, I wanted $20 per item. Well, okay. Are we talking about per user, or are we talking, like per device? Because if I have users that utilize a shared computer environment, if I've got 2 or 3 users on a computer potentially, then I only really need to buy one biometric device for that computer, and all 3 users can use it. So if I wanted to do fingerprints there, that would lower that cost per user for the hardware below that $20 threshold, right? Now, if I need to buy one for every single user at every single desk, that's different. In those scenarios, we have a couple different MFA options. There's of course the SMS, which is kind of quickly becoming my least favorite, and is because of the security reasons of it. There's email, which we do. We also do printed OTP codes, which is kind of interesting. And you basically run a report off of PortalGuard, and it gives you 10 9-digit OTP codes, and you can use those in sequence. They're event-based instead of time-based. And so a user can keep that little piece of paper in their wallet or whatever and dig it out and do that. That's a real common scenario where if I have a group of users who are, let's use a casino as an example, they're on the floor. And a lot of times they're not allowed to have a phone device even, much less, anything else that can take pictures or that kind of thing. Printed OTP may not be a bad scenario there, right, for people in the pit, in the casino pit. So there's a couple different ways to do that. I'll turn it over to Christopher and see if I've overlooked one. I'm sure I have.
Well, overlook is a hard thing, but with so many options, you definitely have some choice, especially in vendors. One of the things, just because the question mentioned, kind of non-phone options, I do want to kind of bridge that by saying the authenticator is probably one of the more popular options, and it's technically not phone specific. You can put an authenticator on your browser if you're using Chrome. You can put one on your tablet, and those are free apps that you can utilize. But as far as actual, out of band, not on a phone method, you're really limited to, like you said, Kevin, the printed options, letting the user call the help desk to get a code that's generated in PG, or something, again, that's really out of band would be the token approach. And we support a bunch of different types. Everybody knows YubiKey. And if you go to YubiKey's website, they have 5-10 different types, all priced very differently, depending on how many you buy. If you're in education, you get certain discounts. And some of them are around $20. There's other U2F options too that are just like $15 to $20 a piece. And as long as it's a U2F or a FIDO2 token, PortalGuard will support that as well. And we have seen a little bit more of an increase in those methods just because some brands do offer a lot of discounts for organizations. But I think the cheapest in the token sphere, assuming you have everything else set up, is the lower tier of the RSA tokens. I think they usually run for like 15 a token for the older series. Granted, you have to set up the server and everything for the actual secure ID approach to validate the tokens because it is out of band. But those also work with PortalGuard and are a little bit more on the affordable side.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, and Craig, I saw you did another question, so we'll answer that as well. But the other thing is, if you have a little more budget for a reader or fingerprint scanner, you got to remember with the hardware tokens, there's an overhead. So you'll hear, like if you go to a YubiKey or RSA, they're going to recommend that you issue possibly one and then a backup one. So your cost is already incrementally increased. And that's the nice thing where even though you have, let's say, a fingerprint reader or scanner, we have low profile ones plugged into the USB port, for example. We have a USB-C one that's going to be coming soon. And so those type, you're only going to issue it, right, to, let's say, me, Kim Johnson, and it's not necessarily my identifier. Again, you're actually physically, identifying me, the individual, using that reader, but that reader really isn't the thing that you're going to have to give me two of or backups of, whereas a YubiKey or RSA are going to tell you, hey, not only do you need that, you need like a golden YubiKey. Has anybody seen like the fancy shiny gold one, which is the admin one? So hardware tokens will be cheaper. I think, we could probably talk cost versus convenience and total cost of ownership, I would say. Scanner, fingerprint reader, scanner to hardware tokens, potentially per user, they might actually be more so because you'll have to buy two and ship it to them now that most people are remote.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say, smart cards are another relatively cheap. The getting up and running cost can be high from a perspective of if you don't have familiarity building out a PKI infrastructure. If that's redundant, PKI, the I stands for infrastructure, but building out that kind of deployment, like if you don't have any experience with it, it's not easy to do. It's very complex. So you may be paying for consulting costs and that kind of thing to get it up and running, but the cards themselves can run, like a buck or two a card per user. Mm-hmm. The readers can be attained for as little as in bulk. I think I've seen some for like $5 before. It kind of depends on what you're looking for. So smart card can be a good option for those, but the usability is a little more complex, or it can be for some users. There's some gotchas there, so to speak. But I mean, if you're really looking to do this as cheap as possible, at least per user, that's not a bad way to go. But again, it has its caveats, kind of like every single one does.
Right. Yeah, I would say every single one. And I think it also comes with a caveat of what works for the user, right? So, yes. Or also what by like the NHS to access their spine network, they're required to use smart card. I won't tell you how the doctors cut off the cards and hot glued them into the readers. So that was a whole nother problem. But there was a lot of, for compliance purposes, that was needed. So Craig, you had another follow-up question, which actually I think would be beneficial for everybody on the call, but using that shared device, right? So that's a scenario where some people aren't thinking of right now, or maybe there's just a subset of your users in there, but a shared device with the fingerprint reader on it. Kevin, this is actually probably for you because I think this is kind of what you've been working on with customers, but what do you see customers doing, and maybe an example or two of that shared kind of workstation and using fingerprint to identify people?
Yeah, sure. So we sell our own branded fingerprint readers. We have a range of different costs, different form factors, and we could always get you some information on those specifics. But we typically see a lot of our. I'm just going to use our example because we make them and brand them. But we see a lot of our Eco IDs be deployed, and those are about $40 a unit. Now they are a very particular type of scanner. They're a capacitive based scanner as opposed to an optical based scanner. So capacitive, you're reading capacitance of the fingerprints themselves. I can get into the technicals of that. I don't want to bore people, but the opticals are literally probably what you're imagining, where it's taking a look at optically at my fingerprint, right? And now we're very good at that, taking those fingerprints in. So we see a lot of deployments with those, healthcare being a good example, as Kim had said earlier. That's real common. We do a lot of deployments with fingerprint there. We actually have built into, I won't name names because of NDAs and stuff, but we have built into certain like medicine cabinets at hospitals, our own readers and our software backing them. And so in order for a pharmacist to take out a protected or a Schedule 2, as an example, substance out of those cabinets, they actually have to fingerprint in to approve and verify who is taking that stuff out, and then the software unlocks the cabinet and they can remove what they need to remove, and they log it and and close it up again. So you see a lot of deployments like that. But yeah, you can totally take one fingerprint reader and install it to a computer and have 5, 10, 20 users utilize it. Now, your one big hiccup here is if you try to do this with Windows Hello, the problem you're going to run into, Windows Hello is free, it's built into Windows 10, that's really nice. The problem you're going to run into is every user has to register to every device. So registrations only work on the device that I registered on. If I have to use 3 other computers throughout the day or throughout the work week or throughout the year, I have to go and register on each and every one of those. So that's a pain point. That's one of the things we're really good at. We actually have a shared data, not shared, but we have a centralized database that we store the user's biometric data in, and you can house that on-prem, so you own all of it. You own all the data. None of it has to come home to BioKey or anything like that. We don't even need to have access to it if you don't want us to. You keep that in your own lockbox. But we can actually centralize that, so one registration on one computer works on any other computer with the fingerprint reader installed to it. So that's a really nice kind of pain, an easer, where it eases that pain point. And that's one of the things we're very, very good at. We can do that type of matching in milliseconds, in real time, or near real time rather, on the fly. I mean, it's simple. You can do things like you can touch the fingerprint reader and have it unlock with a simple touch. You can touch the fingerprint reader and have it require a PIN or a password. There's all sorts of different ways to go about that. So if you want to have something physical and something knowledge-based to really truly get that 2-factor and multi-factor approach, we support all that stuff. So I mean, obviously, I'm a big proponent of it. I mean, you can probably tell by the way I talk about it. But yeah, we could totally do those kind of deployments.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think one of the things I found fascinating when I rejoined PortalGuard, came to BioKey, is really the positive identification in manufacturing, right? So if somebody's manufacturing something and you want to know for sure that Kevin's the one that made this part and signs off on this part, the real only way to know for sure that person did that action and to verify and authenticate that person is essentially using the biometric authentication type to say, okay, Kevin was truly the individual that did that. So that's really the power of biometrics. And as you're hearing, I think, and we can go to that next question, I don't think there's any one method. I think it's really based on what each user needs. In the second question, one thing we haven't talked too much about, but I know it's a hot topic, is customer IAM or customer, multi-factor authentication. For a lot of our customers out there, it could be student, right, multi-factor authentication. So what have, Christopher, maybe I'll point this to you first, but what have you seen for more of the customer-facing methods, and how do people kind of approach that implementation and deployment?
I'm trying to think how best to, you're talking just like on a level of popularity kind of thing?
Well, not even popularity, right? But like the same method that's going to work for your employees because you can necessarily like distribute hardware tokens and things like that, do you see a method, maybe it is popularity, that's more popular for the customer facing, right? Based on just usability and convenience for the customer.
I see what you're saying. I apologize. I kind of
No,
misinterpreted the format of what you're looking at. Honestly, it's kind of funny because when you've got kind of customers that have, yes, they're employees, but then they're also got another subset of their own customers utilizing the product, it does put a little bit of a shift on, okay, what can we do? Because like you said, I can't provide YubiKeys to 500 customers using my site. So I have to be a little flexible with the different options. You might be able to get out a handful of them. And that's where the kind of popularity of these, other, maybe the mobile methods or even email tend to come in, because they don't really require much else. But I will say the most popular option that I've seen, at least in the past couple of years, is still the mobile authenticator in those scenarios, because it checks off two really big boxes. One, it doesn't cost really anybody anything except for using a device that they already have. And that has its own caveats, admittedly. But the second option is it is still considered an out-of-band method. So just sending a text message or even a voice call, which is kind of a legacy method, is great for some users, but it's not really true MFA. So if you look, it is, but it's not the best MFA is a better way to phrase that. If you're looking to meet, the NIST recommendations, for example, it's big bold letters in one of their subcategories. SMS is not considered out of band. So a lot of people are trying to, use that if it's necessary, but look for other, equally easy options, and that's where these authenticators come in, especially when they can't necessarily pass along these tokens to these customers that are using their site.
Right. Kevin, anything to add on that for customer MFA, or pretty much in line with what you've seen as well?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably pretty accurate what Christopher described. You see a lot of SMS and email, voice call, and I think truly, the authenticator apps are probably the best way to go in general for that kind of scenario. And if you have a user base that also, your customer base that also doesn't have smart devices, your hands are pretty tied there, because so many of these rely on something, right? Part of a two-factor authentication or a multi-factor, which two-factor is just a subset of, is something I have and something I know. So I have to have something, whether that's my fingerprint or whether that's but I need an associated reader with it, right? Or whether that's a cell phone or a token or something. I have to have something. And so if your customer base doesn't even have a cell phone, so that doesn't work for them, again, it really ties your hands into what you're capable of providing at this point. So.
Yep, and I think that's so first, there is a webinar out there if anyone's interested. It's recorded from our very valued customer, and I'm not sure if anybody's on from that organization, but NASCO, and they do a great story of how they tackled that customer identity access management challenge and what they used for their portal and their login for their plan members, as they call them, or plan administrators. They use the email methodology. The nice thing I would say about the 15 plus methods, at least from our perspective in PortalGuard IDaaS and the platform that we provide, you can provide multiple options for users. So they can go into the user phase, the interface and select, right? Oh, this method isn't available to me. Can I try a different one, right? Based on what the admin has allowed. So that's really the flexibility there, where if you go, let's say, pick an MFA provider that only provides the hardware tokens or only provides push, they're going to give you those options, but there's no dialogue or user experience that's going to say, okay, would you like to use A or B to essentially authenticate and use that MFA? So that flexibility and options is really the key there. So having all the methods to choose from, but allowing the user to choose on their own behalf also once you've set the policy for it. All right, and then so I will turn to the last question. I will remind everybody, please post any questions that you may have into the dialog box. Keep them coming. This is, I would say the three of us could probably talk for hours. We will not, but a great subject to go into. But I will turn it to Kevin. So best practices, let's pick one of your favorite best practices you would say for someone that is sitting there, right? We had a good percentage of people on the call today not using MFA. They're looking at a deployment plan or maybe expanding. What would you say your top best practice would be if you had to sum it up?
Oh, the top one. I have a list here.
Favorite. You can give me two if you can't pick a favorite. That's okay.
I'm looking at my list now to see if I can pick two favorites. It's like two, like who's your favorite child?
Right.
Let's see. Or who's your favorite dog? In my case, would probably be more accurate. Let's see. I would say number one is I've already talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to use this as my one of my two, but like make sure that you're really looking at your user base. Make sure that you understand all the different modalities that your users might run into. You need to be cognizant of different needs for different types of users, and that will put you in a good position to get that project off the ground. And my second one would really be probably to, I would say find an MFA provider, even if it isn't BioKey, even if it, or PortalGuard, or, even if it isn't us. Find a provider who offers you a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can and can't do, what your users can opt in and opt out of. Find somebody who can give you a lot of options. I promise we'll give you as many options as anybody on the market, but if you don't want to go with us, that's okay. Make sure you do your due diligence, make sure you've looked at all the offerings, and make sure you ask a lot of questions about, well, what if I can't do this, or what about this, or what about that, or what about these, to make sure that you've got the right solution for your organization. Because there's nothing like, it could even be the right solution, but the wrong organization, right? Like, this could be really great for this, this group of customers, but not for my organization. Make sure you've got the right fit for your organization and the right flexibility to do what you need to accomplish.
Great. And so I tried to limit you to one, limited you to two because I'm worried you might steal some of Christopher's. But Christopher, how about you? Either your top one or two, if you can't limit yourself.
Okay. Honestly, I think, Kevin, you did touch on what would have been my biggest one, which is know your scope. So I will leave it at that. But it comes down to two things that I think are really overlooked and end up being very important is, one, deploy only what you need. Because a lot of people say, hey, there's 15 methods. I'm just going to deploy 9 of them. Yeah. But then you also have to maintain 9 different methods that are available for everybody. And 6 of them might never be used. But one person will find it, play around with it, and then something will break. But it was never really necessarily an option. And that's just the kind of stress during an MFA deployment that you and your users don't really need. So it's really a matter of find out what you need and deploy just that.
Yeah,
but also, go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say all the methods that you pick, you have to support. So that's, I was just going to echo that. That's, you have to be, your help desk has to be ready to support all the methodologies that you choose. That could be a big deal. Go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry. That was a great point.
No worries. And then last but not least, another one that tends to be overlooked, but have detailed, and I'm underscoring that in the air here, end user documentation, because for the most part, we're all technical folks. When I say mobile authenticator, we all have to know what that means. You can name 4 off the top of your head probably, but Joe Smo over there in HR, not to pick on anybody, might not really know how I'm supposed to use that, and what does it mean to add this to my phone? Where do I do this? And that kind of end user frustration can really just derail an MFA deployment that could otherwise have been going smoothly, but now I've got a whole block of users that just don't know what I'm trying to tell them to do. So really, it's worth taking the time and the extra effort to go through and say, okay, we know what we need. We're deploying these 4 methods. Here's how you use these methods. Here's how you set it up, and be as clear as you can be, because that's only going to make things go smoother. And then the questions you have won't necessarily be like, why doesn't this work? And now a whole department can't get into their resources.
Right. We call it geek speak, right? You got to translate that geek speak into something that everybody can understand.
Thanks, Kim, Kevin, and Christopher, for the great overview of the best practices for a successful MFA deployment. It's not something that is straightforward, but has the best practices possible for all organizations. Speaking of which, I want to highlight 3 key ones that you guys mentioned. 1. Know your scope and look at your user base to understand the different needs for each group of users. 2. Deploy only what you need, as all the MFA methods you select will need to be supported. And 3. Have detailed end-user documentation to provide clear instructions to your users to prevent frustration and make sure your MFA deployment goes smoothly. Anyways, that wraps up today's episode of IAM Pulse. Thank you for listening to the show. If you want to hear more about making sure MFA goes smoothly in your organization, go to our website, www.bio-key.com. Join us next time to learn more about IAM and how to secure identity the way that you want. Talk to you soon.